We're live. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining our first webinar of the year on demystifying carbon offsets. Apologies for the delay, but here we are with our amazing panel. Before I leave it to our moderator and panelists, I would like to spend a few moments to tell you more about Green Story and the work that we do. We are a sustainability platform that enables brands to accurately measure and communicate the positive impact of their products and also to make them carbon neutral. How we do that? We combine life cycle assessment methodology with interactive data and impact visuals and a carbon offset platform. And by doing so, we reach the customer experience with a brand, the Green Story, their sustainability story throughout the customer life cycle. This way, we help them enhance the transparency, increase engagement and loyalty, and drive revenue. We partner with hundreds of sustainable fashion pioneers like Pangaya, ThreadUp, BAM, Bamboo Clothing, and I have a global team of experts that are working towards empowering 1 million consumers to know the impact of their choices, to know their impact and make choices that are better for the planet and the generations to come. Before I go and I leave the stage, please just a reminder to pop any questions you might have on the question tab on the right. We're going to read them throughout the session or just reserve the 15 minutes at the end. We'll see how the conversation flows. And now, without any further ado, I will give the floor to our moderator and panelists to introduce themselves. Amy, would you like to get started?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy. In addition to being a Forbes contributor covering sustainable business, supply chains, and fashion, I also work with a range of organizations, including NGOs, startups that work in the fashion, tech, and renewable energy space as well, really looking at how we can solve some of these complex environmental and social challenges that we currently face. I'm really excited to bring you this fantastic panel today, and I'll let Naomi introduce herself next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy. I'm Naomi Swickard. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Verra, where we oversee a number of different standards for climate and sustainable impact. That includes the Verified Carbon Standard, which is probably the most relevant to this conversation, as well as the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard and Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, which can be combined with the VCS to measure the sustainable development impacts of carbon projects.
Hi, who's next?
Guy, if you want to go next.
Right. Hi, I'm Guy Turner. I'm founder and chief executive of Trove Research. We provide a lot of data to the markets on carbon credits. We use a lot of the Verra data, as well as a number of other major data sources. We monitor all of the corporate climate commitments around the world, not just in the fashion industry, but elsewhere across 4,500 companies. And we provide forecasts of how much these credits are going to cost, and the implications for companies like yourselves looking to go down the carbon neutral journey.
Great, thanks, Guy. And Pepe, over to you.
Hello, thank you, Amy. I'm Pepe Martín, co-founder and co-CEO of Minimalism brand. Minimalism brand is a Spanish company, clothing company, in which you can find since t-shirt to, you can dress yourself, fully dress yourself, even if you're a man or a woman. We got everything that you will need. And we are focused on transparency, also sustainability, and we are here because we are carbon neutral right now. So also I'm here just to learn. So it will be helpful if I can learn something today.
Great, thank you so much for your introduction. And as Laura mentioned, everyone, if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to pop them into the chat and we will answer them directly and at the end as well, depending on their relevance. So I think to get started, we're obviously covering this topic as the various different sectors shift to decarbonize at a rapid pace, given that we are in the crucial climate decade, and especially with the new targets set out at COP26 and everything that will also be discussed this year at COP27. I think it would be great to start off with a question that looks at carbon offsets as one piece of the puzzle. So Guy and Amy, particularly looking to you at this question, how do you see carbon offsets to be part of a bigger climate solution? We spoke yesterday about them not being a silver bullet. So what is it essential for companies to remember about this? Oh, I think you're on mute, Guy. Oh, Guy, it's just the button at the bottom that says microphone. If you click, it should work.
Shall I go ahead and jump in while he figures out the microphone? Sure, sorry about that, guys. So yeah, I mean, I think just starting from the beginning, right? One of the key things to think about with carbon offsets is what's their purpose. And I think that has evolved a little bit in the last few years where, you could measure the footprint of your company, buy some offsets, and call yourself carbon neutral. And I think that there's been, over the last several years, and particularly in the last year, an increase in the level of scrutiny and desire to make sure that companies are really planning for the future before they do that. And so the really key thing to start out with is that, when you're thinking about this from a company perspective, yes, that first step is still very much understanding your footprint, and that covers all three scopes. So scope 1 and 2, your own footprint, but also scope 3, the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. And then once you have that information, really looking at what is a target, for example, something that aligns with science-based targets guidelines, to identify how your company is going to decarbonize over time. How do you actually reduce the footprint of your company through your own operations? Whether that's things like buying renewable energy or shifting supply to those that are lower carbon density per product or input, or dealing with the scope 3 side of things. And once you have a really articulated strategy for how the company is going to decarbonize over time, then you have this transition period from today until you can actually get to that point in the future. And that's where offsets really come in. It's about being able to compensate for the emissions of today and on that pathway towards a long-term net zero target. And those then can help, whether that's towards a carbon neutrality target or other claims around what the company is doing to contribute and finance emission reductions around the world. So it's really important to think of these in context. And this is a space we can certainly talk a lot more about, as I think this idea of what can and should be said based on how those units are being used is a really evolving space right now. But that's really the role. And those offsets help us to drive and finance mitigation today while we make this longer term transition that's going to take time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Naomi. And I think, Guy, if you had something to say on that as well, as offsets as part of the broader solution.
No.
You were unmuted before for a moment.
Shall we move to the next question and come back to him if we can?
Yeah.
If not, you can
Sure.
go in again, Guy, maybe.
Yeah, sure. We can go to the next question. So, Naomi, whilst we're talking about your work specifically, for those that aren't aware, would you be able to explain a little bit more about the different Verra standards and how they work to ensure quality and integrity as well in the carbon offsetting market? I think that would be really valuable.
Yeah, sure. So the standards really play an important role in the market, sort of between the supplier side, in other words, giving suppliers, carbon project developers, the rules and requirements by which they need to develop a project, and the buyer side so that they know that they're buying something where a ton is a ton. And so those standards really play a core intermediary function to make sure that the market can transact credible carbon emission reductions. And the way that we do that, the standard itself is just a set of rules and requirements, the process by which projects are developed, the need to have clear and transparent baselines and additionality and all of these core functions that make sure that carbon credits are real, permanent, traceable, credible, etc. And the way that we do that, in addition to the standard and the set of rules, is three main pillars that help support it. So the first is a set of methodologies. Those methodologies provide the detailed accounting requirements for any particular type of project activity. Those go through extensive review, public consultation, expert review, and auditing before they become a part of our system. We then have the process by which projects themselves are validated and verified, in other words, audited to make sure they meet the rules. And we have a program of accreditation where we oversee how those companies get accredited to be able to do that activity and the process itself. And then finally, a registry system. And that registry system is where buyers and the projects themselves can list and transact. But fundamentally, it's where the units are issued a unique serial number that can be traced from generation to retirement, and to make sure that they are transparent and traceable, and ultimately that a unit is never used more than once and it gets retired for its purpose. So that's the sort of core way that all of our standards work. We have the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, which is the standard for producing carbon emission reduction units themselves. And then the two other standards that I mentioned earlier, CCB and SD Vista, are targeted at the climate, community, and biodiversity side for the CCB standard. And SD Vista allows you to measure, monitor, and quantify impacts from any other sustainable development benefit that these projects have. And so, for example, we have a very wide range of project types, but one of the biggest is in agriculture and forestry, where we see those projects doing a lot of things to work with local communities that help address the pressures of deforestation, but at the same time create alternative livelihoods. And those often have significant sustainable development benefits that can be added on and then verified through those other standards.
Okay, wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so, just out of interest, how long does the process take to for a company to verify this with Verra? Or does it depend on which standard it is?
It depends a little bit on the project type, for sure. There's two separate sides of this. You have the company side, where you need to measure a footprint and develop a strategy. We're not involved in any of that. We're involved more on the supply side, so the development of projects themselves. And it completely depends. A fairly straightforward project where you might be, for example, capturing biogas could be a few months. Whereas a forestry project, especially if you're talking about removals where you might be planting trees and it takes time for them to grow, can take a few years. So it really depends on the project type and the activity, how long that process takes.
Okay, thank you so much, Naomi. Guy, we can hear you now. Shooting back to the first question, now that you have your voice.
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great.
So just to go back to the first question, we were looking about how you see carbon offsets as one piece of the puzzle and as part of the broader solution, and a little bit of the work that you do at Trove Research to kind of underscore all of that.
Yeah, and firstly, just a shout out to Naomi and all the hard work that they do to try and make sure that each project is assessed, to a high degree of scrutiny. But then, just picking up on that earlier point, it really is a part of the piece, part of the strategy that a company needs to adopt, and the word really is, it needs to form part of a credible decarbonisation communication and plan. That the claims of greenwashing will be raised and are raised against companies who are perceived to be just dipping into the carbon credit market without walking the talk and genuinely trying to take their emissions down throughout their supply chain. But that emission reduction can't be done overnight. particularly including scope 3, where fashion companies will have extended supply chains across the world, and they're very, very hard to influence. So that statement, we need to decarbonize before we can use offsets, can only happen over a much longer period of time. So the only thing a company can really do in the short term to sort of avert that criticism is to have a credible plan, where one needs to assess the options available, show progress wherever possible, and put something down on paper and then communicate it. So this is, but perhaps where we're here, which is about the communication of that plan, so it does become credible, and then how carbon credits fit into that. So as a stepping stone, that stepping stone may last 1 year, 5, 10, maybe many more years on that route to ultimate net zero outcome. So it's about the credibility of the plan and the communication of that plan. And then thirdly, the final component is the quality of the credits. And there are 4,500 projects out in the world and growing that can generate carbon credits. A lot of them on the Verra system, others elsewhere, from all countries in the world. Some have just been developed, others go back beyond 10, 12, 13 years. And they were developed at different times, in different countries, different technologies, different purposes. And there's a huge, huge variety of credits that one can access out there. And the market is now starting to differentiate between those which they like and those which they want to sort of distance themselves from. And you see that reflected in the prices of the credits as well. So the nature-based projects are a lot more desirable because of the SDG biodiversity benefits. The more recent credits or more recent projects also tend to be appreciated and valued. If a company is making an offset claim today, it starts to become less credible if the reduction that they're using was undertaken 10 years ago. It just sort of doesn't sort of scan very well from a comms point of view. So there's a variety of things out there, and I think the point is that there is a spectrum of credits that can be made use of, and they have different purposes for at different points in time.
Okay, Guy, thank you so much. And so we touched a little bit on quality of carbon credits. So for the audience, would you be able to just give a top line summary of the key characteristics that you think makes a good carbon credit and a good project as well? The things to watch out for.
Yes, I think it's very hard. Some of them are hard to determine from a buyer's perspective because they're quite technical. But as I said, recency. I know Naomi sort of has a potentially different opinion, but for me, recency is an aspect which I think links quite more directly to the claim of offsetting something. I think additional biodiversity SDG benefits that enhance communities and the nature and other aspects are other good things, as well as simply taking carbon out of the atmosphere or reducing it. And then a more slippery concept is this one of additionality, and all projects should be additional, but over the years the standards have evolved and got better. The methodologies that have been used to assess them have evolved over time. So one really needs to sort of a good, really, really high quality credit is one where you are confident that the money that's being used to buy the credit genuinely affected the installation and operation of that project in the first place. And all of those things combined as sort of, I think, what generally people perceive as high quality.
Okay, great. Naomi, did you have anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, just a couple of additions. One would be the use of a credible standard. I think there are a number of new players coming into the space now who are looking to leverage new technologies, and that is fantastic. And I think there is a way to do that combines well with standards that help make sure that these other issues like additionality, sustainable development, community engagement, and impacts are also addressed. But there are a number of players coming onto the scene who are sort of saying, we can just put a remote sensing in place, and we can look at what's happening, and then we're done. And the process is ready to go. We'll put it on a blockchain, and we can deliver you credits overnight. The intent behind it, I think, is good. But just to say that I think at the moment, it's really important that units that are being used are coming from a standard that meets these quality criteria. And there's a number of initiatives in this market right now that are sort of looking to provide more guidance on the credibility of systems and the governance behind those systems. So the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Markets, which has become the something else name that I'm currently blanking on, apologies, Guy, you might know what I'm talking about, is working on recommendations around sort of almost a meta standard. What are the elements, as Guy was talking about, things like additionality, periods and vintages, and other important parameters of projects, putting guidance on those pieces that need to be in place, as well as how standards are governed. So anyway, we just wanted to emphasize that part of it as well. And then on additionality, it's one of the key things that I think is often hard to understand. We want to make sure that the projects that are being developed are those that wouldn't be developed without the carbon finance. Because these are being used as an offset, they're being used to offset another emission somewhere else. So we need to make sure that it's a real emission reduction. It needs to be a new activity. And that evolves over time for a number of different reasons. One, because the market dynamics themselves change. For example, renewable energy was a project type that was really commonly used for a long time. And Verra has mostly excluded that, except in least developed countries now, because the renewable energy markets have become cost competitive. So they're less likely to be additional in a lot of cases. And so that's something where the standard has evolved to reflect the fact that those activities are not as reliant anymore on carbon finance. We now have a situation where we also need to reassess additionality because of the context of the Paris Agreement. And as everybody starts to implement policy that will require changes that reduce emissions, that narrows the scope for where offsets are appropriate. So there's a lot that happens there to sit behind the quality of the credit, but those rules also evolve because of the changing policy and market dynamics in front of us.
Just to add one point on the integrity committee of the TSVCM.
Perfect, thank you.
And for anyone on the call who is just getting into this space, I will only apologize for the number of acronyms that get thrown around and confuse people, because the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, TSVCM, sits alongside something called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which gives you the sort of the validation of a very sort of aggressive decarbonisation commitment. And another initiative that I'm personally involved with is the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which is trying to sort of grapple with a lot of these issues about what a good claim is from a company, and how does that relate to the walking the talk? How does that relate to the quality of the carbon credit? And guidance should be coming out in later this quarter, towards the springtime, on some consultations for what good looks like at the top end, a race, so we can guide companies to race to the top rather than race to the bottom.
Great, that's fantastic, and thank you for providing the names of all those initiatives. We will be able to collate those and share those with everyone later, so they can read them in their own time and wrap their heads around the work that they're doing. So, just also touching on the voluntary carbon market, Guy, would you be able to give the audience a brief overview of what that looks like now and how you see the voluntary carbon market evolving over the next few years?
Yes, I would be delighted to have a presentation to show you, because we track all of the numbers. The market evolves from the projects that like the Verra hold on, that they're developed and hold on their registry. They are able to create credits. They're issued and held within the registry. They can be then retired on behalf of a company that's making a claim. So they get retired and taken out of the market and cannot be used again. And that's the process. We have about 4,500 projects. The number of last year, 2021, December, we had about 165 million tons of carbon credits were retired throughout the year. So that's quite a substantial. It was about 100 million tons in 2020. So it's grown by over 50% in 1 year. And you can name some big companies. The oil companies will buy a fair chunk to offset some of their fuels. Microsoft was quite public with its tender for carbon credits. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of this market is it is very diverse, and there are a lot of small companies dipping in and making these things. So one can interact directly with platforms the way you can buy carbon credits such as this, or go through brokers or through retail organizations. But I think it's fascinating how you can get big companies like GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, for example, one of the biggest drug companies in the world, or Sky News, offsetting their emissions. And also your local restaurant or your local hairdresser may want to offset their emissions, and everything in between. So it's an incredibly diverse market, and a lot of people are coming at it for different reasons. And it's global as well. It knows no boundaries, which is what it should happen, because it's the climate that's sort of benefiting from this. Next year, will that rate of growth? I think we've seen a bit of a COP, a climate negotiations bounce at the end of last year. But what I'm hearing in the market in January so far is no let up, really. There's still sort of a follow through and a sort of a step up from where we were the year before. And so we could see 200 million ton plus transactions this year.
Okay.
And prices have gone up. Some of the more attractive ones, so particularly the nature-based credits, have gone up more than the others. Some of the older renewable energy credits have come down, actually, but on average they've drifted up, by about 50% since the start of last year. So the market's getting tighter in the short term, but is generating a diversity of prices amongst different project types.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. So moving on to one of the things that we spoke about quite a lot is about how we can communicate and what language and wording we use when it comes to carbon offsetting. Obviously, greenwashing specifically for the fashion industry is a priority focus for the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. So Naomi and Guy, looking at you, how can we avoid greenwashing in this space? I know that so many of the audience are really keen to engage with different kind of sustainability projects in their strategy, but they just want to be able to communicate it correctly without getting slapped wrists for doing it. So please share your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I think Guy has talked a lot about this already, but at the end of the day, basically what is needed is to make sure that a company actually has a plan, that they are setting a target for decarbonization and have a plan to get there. And then you're using offsets as a way of compensating for the emissions that you have today and on that pathway towards decarbonization. And then being very transparent as you can be, about the accounting behind the footprint, about what's inside and outside of the scope that is being accounted for. And then being careful about what's being said publicly around the use of those offsets and how it's part of that broader strategy. I think those are the core elements to make sure that we're avoiding any greenwashing claims. I think the industry involved is also relevant. There tends to be more sensitivity when the industry is something like fossil fuels or airlines that are very fuel dependent. And so, the claims being made are extra sensitive or need to be extra transparent. But I think in this sector, more looking at clothing, it's probably going to be most really important to be putting this in a broader context of sustainability of the supply chains. And the more that can be holistic and communicated in terms of a broad plan and transparency around progress towards those plans, anything that can be done to shore up the accounting and transparency of what's being done, it will help prevent any kind of greenwashing claims.
And I think another aspect of that is the comprehensiveness of and transparency of communication and disclosure. So don't cherry pick good news stories, because customers and stakeholders are pretty smart these days, and they can sniff a good news story and a cherry pick from a long distance. So if they see one thing and say, oh, there's an oil company, and it says, great, we've planted a few trees at the back of our oil refinery. Aren't we great? And there's a picture on the website of some ducks, and some migrating birds wading in a pond. It just doesn't look right? There's a sort of a disconnect, a sort of a mental disconnect, saying we know what the company does, and this is clearly just trying to sort of that's an obvious point. But I think if you're a big fashion or textile company, that people will know there's a big supply chain. They're pretty sophisticated knowledge. So I would just avoid cherry picking good news stories. Be totally comprehensive. We did a review of 1,000 companies' emissions reports and disclosures, and we found a lot of them substandard, that they didn't have the information, the complete information that was needed to assess the company's total footprint. So I think that would be a major thing that I would advise, to say the whole thing, warts and all, but don't cherry pick.
Okay, that's great. And so we talked about transparency. Pepe, just bringing you in from a brand perspective as well, why is transparency so important to the work that you do at Minimalism?
Okay, first of all, I am learning a lot today, so thank you very much.
I see you taking notes.
There are many things that I didn't know before. We have just started with Minimalism, and I think it will never end. So it will be okay for me just to learn something else. For us, being carbon neutral, it wasn't the beginning. The beginning for us was to be transparent. So we filmed everything, we saw everything, we saw our fabrics, we saw our materials. We went to our fabrics to film everything and to talk with the people that is working there, just to check that the labor force that we have is well paid and they are not working extra hours. And we saw it to our clients, and that is something else that we want to be focused about that, because there are many people and many brands that are focused on carbon neutral, but it will come from the client also. I mean, we can be the best doing or being carbon neutral. I know we are not the best because we are just starting, but maybe we will try to be better. But the customers will know everything about what involves to be carbon neutral, and also in which projects the company is involved. So our communication is just focused on that. You can see it watch it in our homepage, and also during the process, you will check the difference between buying organic cotton versus normal cotton, and also the difference between having a fabric in Bangladesh or having it in Portugal, the place where you got it. So we are just focused on that, giving the information to the customer, and let she or he just buy whenever they want, without any sale, without any kind of discount, because we think that if they don't have the margin and they know what to do, they will decide in a proper way.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks, Pepe. I think I may have just dropped out for a minute, but I did have one more topic of discussion, Naomi, as well. We were speaking about, especially with the fashion industry, supply chains are so complex. We're speaking about scope 3 as well. How can we help brands account for their carbon correctly, including their extended supply chain, and how can we ensure that the carbon offsetting there is also as accurate as possible?
Sure. There are various tools out there for looking at how you estimate your scope 3 footprint, and for those where you don't have full traceability, you might be using more default factors by the type of input and things like that. But at the moment, I think there's a lot happening of looking at sort of where we're at today, where a lot of companies might be able to say, my sources are coming from these particular regions, but I can't get all the way down to exactly where. And we have a lot of activity happening on the carbon project development side in things like agriculture, or forestry, or other activities that are relevant to that supply chain. So what a lot of companies are doing at the moment is investing in projects that are adjacent to the supply chain or relevant to the supply chain. There's companies like Danone, for example, and their livelihoods fund, who've invested in a lot of projects on farms and that have to do with water as well, because that was important to their broader corporate strategy. So even though it's not necessarily inside the supply chain or inside their scope 3 accounting, it's something that aligns with their supply chain. So a lot of companies are taking that approach at the moment. As we get more sophisticated at being able to trace and measure the specific carbon footprint of those supply chains and improve traceability, I think that a lot of this is going to shift to internal accounting, or at least accounting of the scope 3 supply chain in a slightly different way than in a project-based way on the ground. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how do we sort of help with that shift, and how might activities become a part of scope 3 accounting when they are inside a company's supply chain. So there's a lot happening in that space at the moment, and probably a lot of additional guidance and tools that will be available in the coming years. So at the moment, I think the best you can do is leverage the tools that are available now to get to an impact assessment, and then be looking at strategies that include, not just how can you reduce the emissions in that supply chain, but how can you have better data around that chain over time, will allow for improved accounting of it in the future.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I am conscious of time, and we've actually got some fantastic questions. So, Pepe, I just thought it would be great for you to share a little bit more on your brand experience in terms of incorporating carbon offsetting into your general sustainability strategy, and what other things you've been focusing on in your sustainability strategy to share with the brands that are also on this call.
Okay, yeah, I can do it. At the beginning, we just start trying to be as sustainable as we can, but as Naomi and Guy said before, we cannot measure that. So even if we want to sell or buy, if we want to buy some organic cotton, we cannot track where the organic cotton come from. So at the beginning it was tough, but then we just start moving from factories to factories, and we also change our buyer. And right now we are kind of, or almost 100% that the organic cotton is coming from Turkey and India. And also we know where they pick it, and for sure we know where we produce it and where our fabrics. Because at the beginning, when we started our project like 3 years ago, there were no information at all about the fashion industry. You ask for a t-shirt in Bangladesh or a t-shirt in China, and they say, okay, this is €2, and they say, okay, but give me some information how it is done. And we say, we cannot do that. I mean, I cannot buy a t-shirt or buy 1,000 t-shirt if I don't know where it came from. So then we start moving to Portugal. We go there each 2 months, kind of, because of COVID. We cannot go as much as I want, but between 1 month and 2 months, we go to Portugal to check everything in our factories. And it was just the beginning, because we are still tracking also with carbon neutral, using Green Story. It was, okay, now we know how to produce it. Let's see how can we measure the transport between our factories to our warehouse, and also from our warehouse to our client home or house. And also right now we are tracking the returns, because in our fashion industry, it will be like 60% returns. That is crazy. So there are many people that didn't think about it. And also there is a footprint over there that if you buy something and you can return it, right now it is around 60 and 65. It depends if it is male or female. So we are also tracking that, because we're going to give the information to our customers. So I think that's the only way to be kind of sustainable, but I prefer to say conscious. That is the word that we are using.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all those various avenues that minimalism are exploring. So diving into some questions, a question from Julia here. She says, there are so many projects available at the moment and the marketplace can be overwhelming. how close does the panel think we are to an overarching certification board? So I'm assuming standardization, if she means that.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the last second half of that question. Can you say it again?
She said there are so many projects available and the marketplace can be overwhelming. How close does the panel think we are to an overarching certification board?
I can answer.
I don't.
Go on.
Go ahead, Guy.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that the task force of scaling voluntary carbon, I don't think there will be a single certification board, but what is being put in place is a sort of an overarching governance structure that will sort of coordinate the standards and ensure that there's commonality and high levels of integrity across any of the standards you see. But I don't think it'll have the same kite mark, because Verra has got a sort of different position in the market to say gold standard or some of the others. But as long as they're all being overseen and sort of policed in the same way, then and the governance is thorough, then that's probably the way things will evolve.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think that, there's a difference between a compliance market and a voluntary market. And while our standards are used in both, when you're talking about a compliance market, generally speaking, the intention within that market is to purchase units at the lowest cost that meet your obligation. Whereas in a voluntary market, it tends to be picking up the space between where there isn't regulation and where you can drive innovation or specific activity types that aren't covered by the regulation. And what that means is a lot of times buyers are quite motivated by certain aspects of the project. So if I'm a company that has a big impact on or uses a lot of timber, then I might want to be investing in, beyond addressing those issues within my own supply chain, in projects that help protect high conservation value forests, for example. And so I'm willing to pay more for that project because it touches on my core business and brings a number of other sustainability benefits that maybe I also have targets around. So because of that, I think we're going to continue to see a wide range of different project types. There's a lot of the other sort of purpose or thing that voluntary markets can do is really be an innovation ground to test new sectors and ways of accounting or ways of reducing emissions that can then be transferred into options that governments or society can implement in other ways. So the voluntary markets tend to be a space of innovation, a space of helping fill the gaps in regulation, and a space where companies can really source units that mean something to them as a company. So I think that diversity of standards and project types has value, which is a bit different than if you have everything regulated or within compliance market where there's more of a goal of just getting a ton to meet an obligation. So while we need to get to that in the long run, that there's much more of a regulated space, frankly, I think voluntary markets kind of long-term goal is working ourselves out of a job, right? We want this space to be covered by regulation, by the habits of companies overall, but in this transition phase, we can drive a lot of innovation and project types that are meaningful to companies.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Naomi, there's lots of questions for you. You're a very popular lady in this webinar. So Raymond says, what is your view on ITMOs and the VCM? i.e., do you think that more than 50% of voluntary projects will move to ITMO? So if you could also explain what ITMO is and the VCM, a voluntary carbon market, obviously, but if you could just explain that to people.
Sure. So this is basically touching on a couple of things. One, how do the voluntary markets interact with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the international agreement. Article 6 was just agreed in Glasgow, and it governs trading under that mechanism. And in Article 6, where a unit is going to be traded from one country to another, so it's going to go from one country's accounting to another country's accounting, or from one country's accounting to an international market like CORSIA, which is the aviation trading mechanism, then it needs to have what's called a corresponding. Well, first of all, that unit is called an ITMO, or an internationally traded mitigation outcome.
Okay, thank you.
And it needs to have a corresponding adjustment. In other words, that the host country essentially takes out that achievement of that ton from their accounting, and it shifts across to the books of the buyer country or company in the case of a platform like CORSIA. So what came out of that agreement is that it's very clearly required to have this corresponding adjustment for a unit that will be used as an ITMO under Article 6. What gets slightly complicated then is how that applies to voluntary markets. And what's clear coming out of Glasgow is it's not required to have that in order to use a unit in a voluntary market. However, there's probably a lot that we need to be paying attention to in terms of the claims that are made on the back of it. And this goes back to what Guy was talking about earlier and the work that the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, is working on this year. Because depending on whether that unit has a corresponding adjustment or not, and whether the buyer company has a long-term decarbonization plan or not, might have bearing on what kinds of claims should be made. And so there's a lot happening in this space around that now. And there's a lot happening around perhaps a shift in terms from things like offsetting to contributions or financing of emission reductions in other places that help make sure that that unit doesn't get used twice and certainly doesn't get used by two countries and a company. So we have to make sure that there's no double counting in the system. Mm-hmm. We also have to make sure there's transparency and clarity around the claims. But I'm sure Guy has an opinion on this one.
Yeah, we're doing quite a lot. We've done quite a lot of work on corresponding adjustments, and I wouldn't want to confuse this call with it because it can get quite technical. But I think Naomi raised a good point about double counting, and none of these sort of technical discussions really are that concerned about double counting. That the systems work fine, so I wouldn't set any hairs running about this. The question really is on double claiming, whether or not a company and a government claim for the same credit, and I think another way of thinking about it, Naomi mentioned what's wrong with just seeing this as a contribution to somebody else's endeavor, a country's target. And a number of companies are looking at that rather than necessarily claiming to offset their own footprint. And there's still we're talking about the market here, and the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets really sort of put the whole market on steroids by saying we need to scale the market, we need to treat this like a financial instrument, we need to have liquidity, get the banks involved, get money flowing, and it was all driven by Mark Carney from the ex-governor of the Bank of England. And there's a lot of good sense in that. But it also, one shouldn't forget that at the end of the day, it's about allocating capital, allocating money to good things. And you can do this yourself. It's great to have the standards and when talking about credits, but there's nothing preventing a company investing in their own supply chain, working with farmers on the ground, changing farming practices, changing labor practices, doing all of this good stuff, and then communicating it openly and transparently. And that may not go through the market, the conventional market, the liquidity sort of route. But a number of companies that we're working with are trying to get involved upstream. So some will dip into the market and go, I need to fulfill my obligation to acquire some credits. Others are saying, what, I want to have control. I want to actually invest in the projects myself. I want to have that localization of it because it's in the country or the village or the town, wherever I'm based. And I want to show that I'm supporting directly that activity and greening my supply chain directly. And a number of companies may take that route as well. And I think both are equally valid.
I think that's a really, really valuable point, especially for so many fashion brands on the call now, is looking at how they can really connect directly with the different nodes of their supply chain, because small things really amount to something quite large as well. The next question I have is from Asaf. Directed at you, Naomi, but I'm sure Guy, you may have an opinion on this as well. So they say, I came across several blockchain ventures associated with Verra, like Token.f. I would love to understand further the trading system and the scalability opportunity of this market.
Sure. There are a number of different companies out there now looking at different ways to leverage blockchain, and that's being done looking more at the whole sort of monitoring and verification system and ways that might be hosted or enhanced by leveraging blockchain technology. And then there's the other side of it, looking at tokenizing things. We are not directly involved in any of the tokenization. So once a unit is generated, and particularly after it's retired on our system, that's the end of where the role as a standard that we play. So there's some very interesting platforms out there that are looking at that space and tokenization and how that might potentially drive additional finance to mitigation, but it's not something that we at Verra are directly involved in.
I would also draw a distinction between the technology, so distributed ledger technology, DLT, from the first point. Second point, tokenization, which applies the DLT to a certain category of projects, literally for administrative efficiency. And thirdly, cryptocurrencies, which have there's been talk in the media about carbon cryptocurrencies, which apply a tag to a particular, to a credit and try and trade that as a new currency. And I think there is merit in the technology to improve the administrative efficiency of the systems. I don't think any of the systems at the moment are substandard in that way. It's just an efficiency gain. I can't think I'd have not heard of any credits being used more than once in the system on the voluntary side. But the cryptocurrency, I think, is a different issue, and I think that has a number of danger signals and warning flags associated with it. So I personally wouldn't touch those.
Okay, great. There is another question that's actually just come in from Benjamin. He said, would you advise a project developer company to have a DLT to track and add accountability to the offsets?
I mean, this goes back to the technology side of things. And I think there's going to be a number of innovations over the coming years about leveraging new technology, whether it's blockchain and distributed ledgers, or whether it's integration of more sophisticated remote sensing technology. So there are opportunities there. We are working on what is possible and how to best integrate that within the standard system. So if you are interested, please reach out. I'm happy to put you in touch with our innovations team that is developing that. But it's probably too big of a topic to dive into the detail on this call.
We've just got a few minutes left, so I will have one more question. There is one question from Jack here about Verra. So he says, where is Verra positioned compared to the CDM/SDM work done by the UN climate change? He says many countries such as Australia adopt the CDM/SDM gold standards. Verra, as that's how they certify credit. Could you share a little on the difference and the relationship?
Sure. So there's two separate periods that we should be talking about here, under the Kyoto Protocol and under the Paris Agreement. So the CDM was established under the Kyoto Protocol as the official trading mechanism between Annex I countries and developing countries around the world. When Verra was started, was set up to be a more efficient version that could serve as voluntary markets that leveraged the same sort of systems and standards and level of quality that CDM was based on. So Verra allowed for a number of CDM methodologies, for example, in the beginning. Today, that is now shifting from CDM under the Kyoto Protocol into the new Sustainable Development Mechanism under the Paris Agreement. But the Paris Agreement has more than one option. It has Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Article 6.2 allows for two countries to agree on how that trade will happen, and many countries are leveraging other standards. So the VCS gold standard, our systems can be used as the basis for a trade, a basis of creation of the units that can be traded between countries or can be traded between regulated companies within a country and the sourcing of units. And we're seeing a number of countries test that now. And Article 6.4 would be the new version, if you will, of the CDM, created and run as a UNFCCC mechanism, which is also an option and may be based. So I think what we're seeing going forward is a slightly more fragmented market with more options, where countries have a bit more control over what systems they want to use. But the standards like ours and gold standard have been are now able to be used in that context in a similar way that the CDM was.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, and so we'll wrap up there. There are some other outstanding questions at the moment. Stefania, I can see that you have one related to how fashion brands can get started on calculating their carbon footprint, and I'm sure that's something that Green Story can absolutely help you with. But for now, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Pepe, Naomi, and Guy for this really enlightening discussion. I've learned so much. So thank you so much for your time, and we will pop lots of notes into the email later so that you guys can follow up accordingly. So Laura, I'll hand over back to you now.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This was really great. And it was fantastic to see so many questions and also so much activity going on the chat. Thank you, Guy, for answering the questions directly on it. You were managing it pretty well. Thanks to all the panelists and also to you, Amy. I learned so much from a personal perspective, so I can just echo what Pepe said. And I'm sure that a lot of the people in the audience did as well. If anyone has any pending questions, please feel free to reach out directly to connect@greenstory.ca, or if you have the contact details of the panelists, I think Guy shared this email address on the chat. Feel free to send it to him directly. Thanks again to everyone. And if you have any questions on Green Story, just feel free to connect directly from the website or to just check it out. Until the next one, which will be more likely at the end of February. I'll see you then. And an email with thank you will follow up today, and also it will include the recording in case you missed a part of it. Thank you, everyone. Again, it was a great pleasure to host you. Thanks for your time, sharing your experience and your knowledge.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.